Good morning, Madam Chair. Carlos Ramos, the Secretary for the California Technology Agency and members. Before I begin, I'd actually like to make a brief introduction of Lorenza Pennington, the lady sitting here at my side. We have within the state an academy, if you will, a training ground for up-and-coming leaders in technology. It's called the IT Leadership Academy, in which we take 25 of the best and brightest up-and-comers, and we put them through a year-long course of training them how to be leaders in technology. Lorenza is shadowing me today, so I've invited her to be up here at the table with us, and if you don't mind, I'd like her to introduce herself.
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is Lorenza Pennington, and I work with the Department of Healthcare Services, and I want to thank you very much for the privilege of being able to attend this session with you guys today. Thank you.
All right, welcome. We're happy to have you here with us.
Thank you. So with that, I do have a couple of brief comments, and then I'll pass over to my colleague, Mr. Klass, over here from DGS, and then just be open to questions or comments from the panel or from the committee. I wanted to share with you that my own background is that I've worked within government, both as a CIO of a department trying to implement systems and manage infrastructures. I've worked at a state data center, responsible for acquiring hardware and software and at times technology services. And then I've also worked in an office that was responsible for running big technology projects. So I've gotten to see procurement from a number of different vantage points, I'd say, within government, and particularly as a practitioner of technology. Also, I've been out in the private sector, so I've gotten to be on the other side of the table, trying to respond or help agency or departments respond to technology procurements that the state puts out. And then finally, and most recently, I've been at a control agency with oversight responsibilities around the way the state manages its technology portfolio. And so I've, over those different experiences, I've gained some insights that I'd like to share with you. One, and the most obvious insight is that technology procurements really are different, in my mind, than regular procurements or procurements for other sorts of goods and services for a couple of reasons. One is that typically in a technology procurement, what we're really after isn't necessarily acquiring a particular type of technology or technology service. What we're really after is to try and address a business problem or an operational problem. Technology just happens to be the means by which we're trying to address those issues. Secondly, because technology is moving so quickly and evolving so quickly, oftentimes in the middle of a procurement, the sorts of technology that's available really changes and evolves even during the course of our procurements. And then finally, that because we are trying to address a business problem, oftentimes there are more than one ways to approach it or more than one solution to a problem. So I think that presents some particular challenges when we're trying to acquire technology or the different sorts of technology solutions to address our business problems. The other thing I would point out about technology procurements is that they're not all the same, obvious kind of a statement, but really as I look at it, they fall into a couple of different categories. And because they fall into different categories, we also have different procurement vehicles for each of them. I would say, roughly speaking, we have procurements around technology where we're trying to acquire hardware or equipment. We have procurements where we're trying to acquire software or, technology programs. We have procurements where we're trying to acquire services, technical services, programmers, people to come in and do security assessments, those sorts of things to help us run projects. And then at times we're trying to acquire actual IT systems or solutions. Each of those has their own individual procurement vehicle, and I think also each of those have different challenges and complaints that I guess we hear about with regard to our current technology procurement process. I would like to share with you that both when I was on the outside and in my previous roles, and especially now that I'm in the role at the technology agency, the most common complaints or challenges that I hear about with our technology procurements. I would say by far the most common and I think challenging complaint that I hear is that our procurements take too long. And this is especially true when we're trying to do procurements for technology systems. Oftentimes they're multi-year processes, And that's frustrating and costly for the bidders that are trying to respond to our procurements. And it's also, I think, an element of risk as we run these projects. I do have a handout here that I'd like to share with the committee. If you want to go ahead and hand those out, just hand them out this way and give them to the sergeant here. What this is a high-level view of our traditional IT procurement process. As you'll see when you get it. It's very detailed, a lot of steps, and it's a very long process. Some of these processes, I think, are, and actually all of them, are really meant to address some of the risk involved in trying to develop and deploy a technology system. But the bottom line is they do add a lot of time. The other thing I would point out is that there are multiple agencies and parties involved in the review and approval of the different steps along the way. There's our agency, the Department of General Services, certainly, the Department of Finance at times the legislature and the Legislative Analyst's Office. But there are a lot of steps to go through. It's a long process. Although it's laid out here sequentially, at times you have multiple steps going on and processes going on at the same time. And they're very confusing to departments that are trying to go through and run a procurement. They're also very challenging for the vendor community and the bidders that are going to be bidding on our different procurements. The main point I wanted to make about this process is that although there are steps in there that are really necessary to mitigate risk, to ensure that we have fair and open competition, that departments actually have a really good sense of what they're trying to procure so that when we do end up at the end of the process that we get a good system, there's room for improvement there. There's certainly things that we think could be done to reduce the length of time, because a long procurement cycle, I think, does increase risk. It exposes us to, one, changing requirements. As you're trying to build or address a business problem, there's certainly changes in policy and practice that take place along the way. There's certainly changes in technology, so what you started with as your idea for how to address an issue at the beginning of the process may be quite different, and you may have other solutions available by the time you get to the end. And like I said, with that many steps, there's also multiple places where you're at risk of messing up along the way. For our vendor partners, I think it becomes very difficult to really get an accurate gauge of how long is it going to take, how much are they going to have to invest up front. And then, there are a number of places where they could slip up and have invested a whole lot of time only to miss a step and be disqualified at the end. To that end, our agency, the technology agency, along with the Department of General Services and a number of other technology practitioners within the state, have begun looking at the whole project life cycle. Within our agency, we've kicked off a process to look at our parts in the approval process and seeing if there's ways that we can simplify them, avoid redundancy, shorten the process, and make sure that we get really good value out of them, so that if we take risk mitigation strategies, that they're actually aimed at the factors that increase risk in a project or in a procurement. Anyway, like I said, I just wanted to share with you the process because, as you can see, it's a very long, it's a very complicated and convoluted process. The other complaints that we generally hear about, and what I'd like to do is just go through them all, talk a little bit about some of the procurement models that we see as showing some promise in addressing some of these issues, and then open up to questions and from the panel. Some of the other complaints that we hear about frequently are the terms and conditions that the state imposes around technology projects make it difficult for vendors and bidders to respond to our bids. In some cases, because of changes in regulatory laws, it places bidders in a position of either having to take on very, very great risks that may not be tolerated by their boards or their shareholders, or have to forego competing on some of our procurements. Third complaint that we hear often is that because our process is so long and because there's such an evolution both in the needs of the state of what we're trying to get and also in the area of technology, that we go for too long of a period of time where we close down communication with the bidder community. We put out our requests for bids, or we put out our needs, and then we expect them to wait and go through this whole process and then submit a proposal that's both responsive, that doesn't miss any of the steps that are important here within the process, and that it's low cost and perfectly meets our needs. As I said, very often, with the changes in practice and in technology, there's a need for either clarification as to making sure that the bidders understand what the state is actually asking for. At times, our own needs evolve over that period of time, and to get clarification about the technology models that we envision when we start the process. Other complaints that we hear off, and this is something that I think our agency really can help departments to work on, is that oftentimes the requirements that the state puts out in requesting responses from the technology community are relatively unclear, or at times just very confusing or unreasonable or unrealistic. So I think that indicates both the need to have in the process the ability to refine requirements and to clarify, what does the state actually need. I think what the state often does is we understand what our business problem is. We don't necessarily understand how do you translate that into a requirement or into communication that the vendor community can respond to in the form of a bid. Other challenges that I hear about is that there's an inconsistent application of procurement policy. You may go to one department and they'll run a procurement in a certain fashion, and what's perfectly acceptable there doesn't necessarily get applied evenly across the state. Different agencies, different departments interpret policies and practice differently. I think this is frustrating to the bidder community. I think it's also frustrating to the technology community because, as often happens in government, folks move from department to department. And so what works in one place may not necessarily work in another spot. Or a CIO from one department may hear that a certain agency went through and acquired technology in a certain way, and they may think that may be an answer for us, and they run into the challenge of different applications of technology and procurement policy. I think, again, both for the state side folks that work around technology and procurement, as well as for the vendor community, oftentimes there is a confusion among the roles between the Department of General Services and the the California Technology Agency, and at times even the Department of Finance. The question is, okay, who approves what, and what does the approval by this agency mean in regards to the rest of the process? I think that's certainly something that within the administration we can work on, and to work to clarify and really make it clear both to the state agencies as well as to the vendor community where are the different handoffs and how do you reconcile the processes, one, to avoid redundancy and duplication, and to avoid frustrating our constituents. Just a couple more that I wanted to point out too. One is that one of the complaints that I hear frequently is that the approach that the agencies, and mostly the control agencies I'll say at this point, take is quite different than the approach the line departments take. The line departments usually are trying to focus on an outcome or producing a result or addressing a business problem. The charge that gets leveled at us, I'm sure DGS gets it as well, is that we're focusing on avoiding lawsuits or winning lawsuits when they inevitably happen. And so where we approach things from a risk perspective, how do you mitigate risk? How do you minimize it? How do you prepare it so that if there is a blow up, you're in the best possible situation? Departments are just trying to achieve some sort of initiative or some sort of outcome to address a business problem. That does present itself at times in terms of what is allowable or not allowable in procurements. How much can we talk? How much can with the bidders? What can we negotiate? What can we not negotiate? Those sorts of challenges, which again make procurement rather difficult. The other I think a compilation of these different challenges at times limits vendor participation or bidder participation. Too many of our procurements end up with just one or just a couple of bidders, whereas as a principle, I think the idea of more competition really being a better result from our procurements. It's one that helps us drive down cost, oftentimes presents us with multiple approaches or multiple solutions to the business problems we're trying to solve, and overall I think is better for the state, results in better outcomes. Along with that, we frequently get complaints about our procurements, because they take so long, because they are sort of costly for bidders, and because at times they do impose a cost burden on bidders, preclude small business from actually being able to participate. So efforts that we can take to try and reduce the burden and really encourage and increase participation by small business and multiple bidders on our procurements, I think is a worthwhile and admirable goal. And then finally, two last ones. One is that the complaint that we have that I hear a lot is that some of our administrative requirements add cost to the cost of a vendor to respond to a bid, and then also get passed on to us in the form of the final cost of what we pay for a system or a technology. So, for example, requirements around how we structure our payments and how much we withhold back, or at times requiring vendors to post certain bonds or letters of credit, those sorts of things. While they are a risk mitigation on our part, they do impose barriers for bidders to our procurements. And then the final one that I would say is that I think the vendor community, and I'm sure you'll hear from them as well, would appreciate an ongoing dialogue with the state around how do you refine your procurements, which models work, which ones really cause problems for the bidders as well as for the state departments. There are a number of different efforts and initiatives and activities that I think can be done to address each of those, and maybe we can talk about that as we go through the panel discussion. What I would like to point out, though, is that we have, as an administration, and I think all parts of the administration have heard these complaints, and they're not new complaints. And we are making efforts to try and address the different issues. What I would say as well is that in spite of these challenges, we have tried different and innovative procurement models, some of which I think show real promise, and some of which show promise but probably still need to be refined a bit further. I'd like to discuss two or three of these examples because I think they're ones that show, one, that there are different ways to approach procurement, and then secondly to highlight some of the good things that we see in those procurements. The first one is I'd like to talk about the Fiscal project. It's one that we're all aware of. It's a big project. What I like about the procurement model there is that they approached it by doing a two-stage procurement, really aimed at the idea of giving vendors a better idea of what it is that what are the business problems that the state is trying to solve. Secondly, doing a little bit of pre-qualification of the bidders so that we know that we have more than one qualified bidder, that these bidders have the opportunity to understand what our business needs are, and that we are able to foster communication throughout the procurement process. In this particular procurement, the first phase was to identify qualified bidders. Once we identified those bidders, we said, okay, we're gonna expose you to our business operations and give you a chance to interact with our business folks, so you can see what our business challenges are. You understand the scope and size and magnitude of our processes, and then at the end of the process, we're going to ask you to do a gap analysis where you come in and say, okay, based on what you're trying to achieve and based on the operations as you presented them to us, here's the gap, and here's where we think we can present a technology solution to address those gaps. Secondly, we paid the vendors. Obviously, I'm sure they'll tell you not enough, but we did pay them to produce this gap analysis. But at the end of that, one of the requirements in order to be paid was that you had to submit a compliant bid. That was our effort to try and ensure that there was more than one bid, and not only a bid but a qualifying bid for the eventual solution. And then the other thing that I liked about that particular process is that we built in a negotiation part into the procurement, so that once a bid is in, you can sit down and negotiate with the bidder, including looking at things such as terms and conditions. Obviously, it's not a perfect process, but one that I think shows a lot of promise. I think if you talk to the bidders, they'll tell you it's probably still too long of a process, but it's one that we see some promise in. The other thing I like about it too is that if it works out well, if the bidders have a better idea of what they're bidding against or what they're bidding for, we're quite hopeful that the responsive bids that we get at the end will be closely aligned with our actual needs, and hopefully reduce the need for change orders down the road. A couple of other ones that I would point out real quickly, and then I'll turn it over to Fred here, is the Franchise Tax Board's Enterprise Data to Revenue project. Again, where they had a process, of one trying to pre-qualify bidders as well. But what I particularly like about this particular procurement is that the way that we're paying the vendor on this is that they're being paid out of the proceeds of any benefits or results that accrue to the state. In this case, we're trying to generate more tax revenues. So rather than the state paying for things up front, they're bringing forward a solution, they're implementing it, they're applying the technology, and they're getting paid out of the proceeds of any increased revenues that come in. We think that's one that shows some great promise. I understand our colleague from the LAO was going to go over the CalBreeze project, so I won't go through that one very much, other than to say that this is one, again, where we think it's a good example of a procurement model that may have wider application. I'll conclude my remarks only by saying that as an agency and as an administration, we have heard these complaints. We do have a great level of interest in trying to address the issues and the challenges that are involved with our current procurements. We've kicked off processes and initiatives already to review both policy on the procurement and just IT policy in general, as well as the project lifecycle and approval processes, to see if there are ways to shorten them and simplify them. We are in discussions and working with the Department of General Services around, how do we do the handoffs better between the stuff that we're responsible for as well as the stuff that the Department of General Services is responsible for. And we're trying to actively find ways in which we can interact with the vendor community to hear their ideas as well. Other than that, I'd open to questions or turn it over to Fred.
I think maybe we'll have all of you make your presentations and then ask questions, because the questions may span areas of responsibility there. So, Fred, we'll let you go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate you holding this hearing so that we had an opportunity to chat about this important topic. It means a lot, both to DGS and CTA. We would love to be able to improve, and I'm sure we will, the IT procurement processes in the state. With your indulgence, I'd like to actually start off by introducing the Deputy Director for Procurement in the Department and the state's Chief Procurement Officer, Jim Butler, and having first give you a little overview of some of the things that have happened in the recent past to improve the processes, and then I'll talk about what we can do more of in the future.
Thank you. So it's my privilege to just share briefly with you some of the progress that's been made. When I first joined the state about 3 years ago, I was told that this is the biggest single problem that you'll get to work on, Jim, and it's actually been very rewarding. So let me just walk you through a couple of charts. And I'm going to stand up. I'll try to project so everyone can hear me. But you've been given a handout that is a version of these two charts I'm going to refer to. I'm just going to switch them up. We did some analysis about 2 years ago because we wanted to find out where are the real problems happening for us in our IT procurements. And what we found is that the state has multiple ways to buy information technology. And most of those processes get done very quickly. In any given year, the state will actually do between 8,000 and 10,000 IT purchases of any kind. And the vast majority of those are actually completed within a few weeks, or sometimes within a few months. However, there is one category, and Mr. Ramos referred to that, where it takes the state historically years to complete the procurements. That is what we refer to as these complex systems integrations projects, where we're buying not just a computer or a piece of software, but we're really buying a solution. And that requires an integrator to come in and really build it from the ground up. Those transactions represent less than 3% of the total procurements in any given year. It's a very small number. However, they represent a lot of the dollars, upwards of 35% of all the dollars that we spend in information technology. So they tend to be very high profile. They're very impactful, and that's, I think, for the most part, where we're seeing a lot of our issues. So let me transition to the next slide and just explain what we have done over the past couple of years to address that. We found that the process was taking up to 29 months on average for these large, complex systems integration projects. And we looked at that process and tried to break it down into its major pieces and figure out, well, where could we rationalize this? Where could we cut out, unnecessary steps And we're able to design a process that can deliver one of these procurements in between 9 and 12 months, depending on what the procurement actually is. And we achieve that by eliminating some of the steps that have proven not to really be helpful in the past, such as conceptual proposals or detailed technical proposals. We also took some other steps that I'll go ahead and take my chair again that I can outline. And as I outline those steps, I'll also talk about the results that we've been able to see since those have been put into place. We created what we call well, let me first start out by saying there were some legislative changes that were passed in 2009. It was in Assembly Bill X 4-21. One of the changes that happened was allowing for what we call now these multi-stage procurement models. Historically, if a contractor was hired to help design or consult on a system, they could not also deliver it. It was referred to as self-dealing, and I think that a wise practice for many consulting types of relationships. You want a good separation between the designer and those that actually build it, so they don't fill the design full of perks and nice expensive options for themselves. However, in the technology world, we found that it's rare to find providers that can only that can deliver without also helping to do the design. And so the change that was allowed was that when the director of DGS and the secretary of the technology agency agree to it, then the state can conduct a multi-stage procurement and allow the contractors that help design the system to also create it. And we've established some very strong rules around how that operates to help avoid any kind of graft or other sticky situations. The next thing that happened is that bill also reduced withholds for low risk procurements. You may have a very large procurement, such as our contract for buying personal computers and servers. The dollars are very large, but there's really very, very little risk with that. The technology is mature, it's well established, and the vendors are, certainly, large enough to back up their technology. So for those kinds of projects, we are able to take the withhold down under 10%. And then there were some policy changes that we implemented. Probably the most impactful were what we call our RFP boot camp. For one of these large systems integration projects, we will dedicate procurement officials and legal staff with the client agency and really kind of put everyone together on a project team for a month or two, and as a team create all the requirements. So that avoids the process of the client sending over their list of requirements to DGS, the procurement official giving them feedback, waiting for them to update it, and then once those two groups are happy, then we send it to legal, who then would give their feedback and start the whole loop over again. And you can see how that kind of a process would really waste time. In fact, using that process, it typically took up to 90 days to do a single addendum to one of these large procurements. So by dedicating these teams and having these boot camps, we're able to significantly shorten the time. I've talked about our two-step procurement model. I believe Ms. Lee will also speak to that. And then I would just say, let me talk to the outcomes. We designed that process to get us down between 10 to 12 months, and we've seen the time actually fall by half, so from 29 months down to about 15 months on average. The trend is still continuing to go down. The number isn't quite where we wanted, but we also have a number of legacy projects that were still in the calculation. And so as those work their way through the system, we expect that these numbers will continue to fall, and we believe we can get this average down closer to under 12 months. And then also we made greater use of negotiations, and I'll just finish by saying that by using negotiations, we were able to award a number of very high-risk, high-profile contracts, including the Franchise Tax Board Enterprise to Data to Revenue project, the Caltrans Construction Management System project, and also the Breeze project, which will also be discussed later. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. As the chairwoman mentioned at the beginning of this, the private sector has its failures too. The Harvard Business Review recently did a study, and they looked at public sector and private sector projects, not so much to compare them. The study was really about IT projects and whether they succeed or fail and what some of the best practices are. And they didn't find any significant difference between the private and the public sector in the success rate or failure rate of IT projects. But what they did identify was that these are large projects. They're very complicated, and making sure that you've got the best practices in place and the best tools in place is what determines whether or not you can make them a success. And I think the private and the public sector have both been learning over the past couple of decades about what makes a complicated project successful. As I'm sure you know, some of these projects are just enormous. They're overwhelming sometimes when you think about the data involved. We could be taking, in the case of FisCal, for instance, we're taking literally hundreds of systems and merging all of that data into one system. So just thinking about the fact that some of those systems use a 3-digit numeric number and some use an 8-digit numeric alpha number, and how you convert all of that data into one database and make it all the same gives you some sense of how detailed and down in the roots these projects have to be in order to think them through and make sure that they're successful. And I'm giving you a PowerPoint, I hope you have it, or some slides. It's just 3 slides there that I'll walk through in a minute. But I think the overarching comment or observation I'd want to make is that I think the single most important thing, although there are many important things that go into making a successful project, and one of the things we've learned over time, as was alluded to both by Carlos and Jim, is that we need to have more communication with the vendors on these projects. They are too complicated. There's too many moving parts to do the traditional kind of procurement process where we sort of write up what we want, we send it out there, and people submit sealed bids, and we open them up and hope they understood what it was we wanted and were able to comply. And so we need to work on new procurement systems that allow us to have the kind of back and forth that goes on with FisCal and some of these other projects, so that the vendors take the time to truly understand what we're talking about as a state in the way of what our business problem is and what we're trying to get to. And the state, on the other side of that, can understand what these systems really can do and better understand whether or not that technology is going to get us where we want to go. One of the other best practices in all of those things is that when you're buying some of these large projects that are enterprise-wide and more or less off-the-shelf projects, is to not try to customize them too much. The more you customize, the more complicated it gets for the vendor to meet your needs, and the more likely you are to run into problems as you move forward. And the challenge for the state and for departments in doing that is that they have to then think about their business practices rather than just automating a system that they have now, a set of processes that they have now. They have to think about, well, what can this system that we're going to buy do for us, and how can we get that system to get what we need? And that may not be flowing the paper the same way. It may not be categorizing the numbers the same way, because the system does it differently. But just because it does it differently doesn't mean it can't give us the basic data and the outcomes that we need. So we end up with this situation, which is sometimes a challenge and a point of risk and failure for projects, of departments needing to do something they haven't done before, which is to think about what's the core basic information we need and how do we get there, and not think about how have we gotten there in the past, but how can we get there in the future. And sort of as I go through these points, I think my overarching point about the most important thing we can do is improve communication on all of these issues. Make sure that the projects understand what their role is in terms of defining requirements and their need to think about re-engineering their business processes necessarily. Communicating with the vendors about the various roles of the state agencies that are involved and what they need to do in order to satisfy those various requirements, and making sure that the various agencies involved in doing the procurement, whether it's the project implementing department or DGS or CTA, are communicating amongst themselves and are being clear not only amongst themselves but with the vendor and the project about what our various roles are and how we should proceed, so that we don't end up in situations where we're fixing things on the back end because folks didn't understand or they didn't have the right expertise applied and there wasn't communication among all the parties about what was expected. With that, then, I'd run through these points fairly briefly. So on the first page, the roles and responsibilities, as Carlos mentioned, I think you're probably going to hear from the vendor community. We need to clarify the DGS and CTA roles, and we might roll finance into that as we move along. Our two agencies have been working together to make that clear, but questions come up about the relative roles and responsibilities of the technology agency versus DGS when it comes to things like reviewing the RFP, what's the timeline for that review, who has the ultimate say if there's a difference of opinion about some aspect of an RFP, a request for proposals, or with respect to an FSR for that matter, where the department is laying down its business case. So we need to be clear with the departments and the vendor community about what our respective roles are. Some of these are pretty in the weeds, but I think they are the kind of things that can help us shave days and weeks and months off of these procurements. The next one is combining the feasibility study report and the technology procurement plan. The FSR actually belongs to the technology agency, and as I mentioned, it's the place where the department makes the business case for moving forward with an IT project. And the information procurement plan belongs to the DGS, and it's where the department is telling us how they want to proceed on a procurement, whether it's going to be negotiated or it's going to be traditional timeframes and so forth. And while there's a lot of difference between those two documents, there are overlaps between them. And they're on different time frames, and they're reviewed by different departments currently. But every once in a while, we find that these overlaps are places where the other department should have known. One department was told one thing by the project agency and another thing to another department. So we're combining these together, make sure that the project department is putting down in one place all the questions that need to be answered. The project approval, improving the accuracy of the FSR. You know, a lot of the back and forth that you hear about and the complaints that things take too long when CTA is sitting on it or DGS is sitting on it is really that it's going back and forth, that a document has been submitted by the project agency and one of the review agencies has questions, so they've sent it back. And then it comes back, and then there are more questions, and it goes back and forth. Some of that is the nature of the beast, but I think we would all agree that a lot of it is just that the product that was originally turned in wasn't what it should have been. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that you have proper training and that the departments understand the purpose of the FSR. It's very much like a department requesting a budget augmentation, basic standard questions about why do you need this, why can't you do it some other way. Oftentimes those questions aren't answered in the first submittal. And then delegation. We would like to see departments delegated to do more on their own without assistance from us. The delegation levels in some areas haven't been changed in quite a while, and they're different between CTA and DGS. So CTA may delegate a project because they believe a department's got the competent staff to actually implement the project, to be good project managers, but they may not have the skill set to actually do the procurement. And so to some extent, the delegation levels will be different depending upon the circumstances of the department. But our staff have been looking at it and comparing the current delegation levels, and we think that probably in at least 30% of the cases we can line up our delegation levels so that departments aren't caught in a catch-22 where one says go forward and one says doesn't. Procurement planning. Standardizing the requirements for writing and training. This is something I'll talk about a little bit more later on, but it gets, again, back to those basic points I made, that we need to do a better job in the state of identifying, avoiding, and resolving problems up front in a project rather than on the back end. You know, one of the things we found in the past with the way we wrote requirements and the lack of conversation between the state and the vendors was that there was a lot of misunderstanding. Both parties entered into a contract thinking that they knew what they were going to get, and then it turned out they didn't. And we spent a lot of time with change orders and lawsuits and delayed time in getting a project done. The more we can train our staff within the state on how to write requirements and how to be clear about them in a way that the vendor community will understand, the more likely we are to avoid those kinds of misunderstandings. And then, as Carlos was mentioning, there is a need to do refresh on requirements after 12 months or so. Occasionally, we have these projects that drag on, and we write the requirements, which are basically, here, vendor, this is what we need the system to do, and then it drags on to 6, 8, 12, 16 months, and now the requirements have actually changed, or we've decided to look at them a different way. And if we don't go back and do that review, then we may end up forging ahead on a procurement that doesn't really have requirements written the way we would like them to be written. In resources, requiring staff staffing plans for the FSR approval process, require completion of training within the agency and with the departments for procurement leads, and ensuring that projects have effective governance policies. All revolve around this same point, that it's not just a matter of identifying what your technology needs are or what your business problem is. It's also identifying how are you going to go about doing this. As human beings engaged on a project and trying to find a solution, who's going to make the decisions? Who is competent to do it? Who's been trained? And who has the experience? And we think that rather than just submitting a plan that says, well, here's my business need and this is what I want done, it should also be accompanied by, and here's the people I'm going to put on it and why they're good to put on it. It's something that you don't need to be an IT expert to understand, the basic project success principles. And then finally, procurement execution. Revisit the negotiated terms and conditions with the industry. As Carlos mentioned, this is something we plan to do. I think there was a major effort in that regard several years ago, but it's time for an update, so we'd like to engage the industry on that. Increasing the use of negotiated procurements. We've talked a lot about that. We think there's a lot more room for doing that in the future. Increasing DGS's own legal affairs, that's an internal issue for me, but we've got some vacancies there we need to fill, and it does slow the process down when there aren't enough people to handle the workload. And then improving our standardized training and our templates. The procurement division already provides a procurement academy, and departments can sign up for this and get an actual certificate on how to improve their procurement skills, but we would like to do even more in this avenue. And the last point there, and consistent with what I just said, is we'd also like to do more in terms of professionalizing procurement staff within the state. So we've been exploring the idea of perhaps having a special civil service classification with a career path in it, a series of steps upwards, so that if folks are particularly interested in IT procurements, there's a specific technical civil service classification for doing that. I think that concludes my remarks now, so I look forward to questions later.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Erica Lee with the Legislative Analyst Office. I believe there are handouts being... oh, you've already received them? Okay, great. So I'll be basically speaking from these handouts. I've been asked to present some of the ways that we do procure these large IT systems. And if you turn to the first page of that handout, this is more of a traditional what is called a firm fixed price procurement. And as Jim stated, you know, the bulk of what we buy in terms of IT is they're smaller kinds of services and hardware and software. But when you get to these large IT systems, you really need to implement something, what they call basically a request for proposal or firm fixed price procurement, where there is a particular process. So this, I'll just spend a brief amount of time on this page to go over what those steps are, and then move on to some more innovative and creative procurements that have been mentioned both by Carlos and Fred. So initially the FSR is approved, and that's that business case that Fred mentioned. This is a department saying this is what we need. These are the business problems that we have, and this is the solution that we see going forward. Once that is approved, the project RFP is released, the request for proposals to elicit bids from interested vendors, and the vendors submit the proposals, the state evaluates the proposals, and the highest scoring vendor is awarded the contract. This is not necessarily the lowest cost for IT procurements. It's what is called the best value, so it's some sort of combination of cost and technical points given for the technical proposal as well. So generally, this is a process that involves, not too much communication by way of the state and vendor, but it's been something that has sort of been tried multiple times and has been deemed sort of the most fair. It treats all vendors equally, and there are sort of less room for protest and less room for litigation in theory. I think the disadvantage of this sort of more traditional approach is that it's kind of a one-size-fits-all when we know already that all procurements for all these systems are quite unique. And so putting putting all these procurements sort of under the same procedures doesn't always make sense. There is, as I stated earlier, a lack of two-way communication between vendors who are expected to understand, okay, these are our requirements, and sometimes the requirements are in the thousands for large projects. And there's no kind of communication to confirm that, yes, indeed, this is what the state is asking for, or the state understanding that the vendor understands what the requirements actually mean. So there's no or there's little ability to test whether the requirements that are included in the RFP actually make sense. So if you turn to the second page, there have been several mentions of what is called a multi-stage procurement, and this is more kind of creative, innovative way of securing the same types of services for these large IT projects. It is similar to the FFP you'll see initially and even on the back end, but there's some important steps that are included that really help to reduce some of the risk and some of the lack of communication that happened in that first more traditional approach. So initially you have an RFP which is released. The RFP includes all the requirements or sort of the framework for the system for which you want built. And the vendors will then respond to that RFP by submitting their proposals. The state will evaluate the proposal, and in this case, there are several vendors that are chosen. The weaker proposals fall out, so those vendors are not invited to participate in what will happen the next stage. This first stage is really sort of like a pre-qualification, as Carlos had mentioned. You know, they're looking for vendors that sort of meet a baseline. So those vendors are allowed to continue on to stage 2. And you'll see below the dashed line here in this example, I call that the stage 2. So what happens next is that there is a competition among the vendors who have sort of made it through that pre-qualification stage. And this is, I've circled the steps. I believe that the key aspect, that the key difference between sort of the traditional way we've done procurements and the new way that Fiscal 21st Century Project, and to a degree the CalBreeze project, which I will mention later, has been trying to secure a vendor. So during this time, the state may or may not pay for the vendors to participate in the competition, really depending on the nature of the contract that is to come and the length of time in which they're doing this, oftentimes called a bake-off or a fit gap. So they're actually sort of making something, and the state will sort of taste test it later and see who wins. But during this time, the key advantage is this is a real opportunity for discussion and two-way conversations to be had, for requirements that were in the RFP to be looked at, vetted, refined in a way that the state can guarantee that the vendors who are participating understand what we're asking for, and on the flip side, that the vendor can really say, okay, this is what I think you mean in this requirement, and the state has a chance to say, well, actually, no, that's not what I meant. Under normal circumstances, under the traditional approach, the state may not find out that the vendor really didn't get it, or the vendor may find out more about the state's systems post-contract, and so I think that's sort of the key thing here. Is they're finding things out before a contract is signed, before the state pays any dollars for any kind of milestone or deliverable. So this is the key aspect of the multi-stage procurement. And then after that time ends, the fit gap or the bake-off, the vendors will then submit a final proposal. And that final proposal will be evaluated by the state. And this, again, is where it's similar to the firm fixed price. The state evaluates them, and ultimately the highest scoring vendor proposal will win, and that vendor will then go on to build that system. It's the same ending point as the FFP, but there's so much more knowledge transfer and understanding of what needs to be done that formerly would have not occurred until much later. So obvious advantages to the multi-stage procurement. We've seen a couple happen in the state. I think time will tell as to how successful this procurement approach is and how much it has to be modified, because again, it still shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. There still needs to be changes to procurements based on the needs of the department, based on the size of the actual project. So that's page 2. And I wanted to turn to page 3 to look at an actual example, a case study, if you will, on on a multi-stage, and it's actually something I'll call it a modified multi-stage, because it's not exactly like what I just explained to you, but the tenets are the same, where you sort of go outside of the box of the traditional procurement method. So the Department of Consumer Affairs is currently working on a project that will integrate many old legacy systems and workarounds to help build a enterprise-wide enforcement and licensing system. So they've got multiple boards. All these boards have sort of their own system. They're trying to unify them and integrate them into one system. Now, the state released the RFP in May of 2010. Now, there are dates attached to this just so that you can get a sense of time frame. And altogether, this procurement took about 16 months. So a little bit longer than, I think, the goal of DGS for various reasons, but still not 29 months. This is 16 months. So the state released the RFP to elicit vendors. They received 10 bidders, 10 letters of intent from bidders. And so this is sort of the initial stage of bidders saying, we think we're interested, and based on kind of what we've heard, that we think that, we would like to submit a bid. So it's a pretty large pool of interested vendors. Now, going from the second box to the third box, there's a time period where there's sort of a sifting of vendors. So vendors sort of learn more about what's actually needed, the state, of what the state's needs are. And at that point, we only have 3 bidders that have submitted a pre-qualification package to the state. So during that point, during points 2 and 3, there's some sifting of vendors. And if you move on to the next box, 3 bidders are demonstrating their products. So this is the point where I would call the start of the bake-off, or the start of a fit gap. This is when the state gets to see, well, what are you bringing to the table? And there's some communication about whether or not that product that they're bringing actually meets the needs of the Department of Consumer Services, of Consumer Affairs. So the demos really help the state to see which vendors can actually play and participate in this competition. Moving on to the next stage, the state selects 2 qualified bidders. So at this point, one of them had dropped out because one of the products didn't meet the state's needs. And again, some of this might not have been found out until after the contract had been signed. So again, this is a good experience, a good time for two-way communication to take place. If you move to the next line, we have working sessions with the 2 bidders. This also is a point where a lot of communication takes place. This is a 20-day, basically a 3-week period where requirements that were in the RFP are being refined. This is where that communication takes place, and where the state can say to the vendors, okay, are these sets of requirements clear to you? In this example, there were only 900 requirements, so not the thousands that I mentioned earlier, but 900 is quite a lot. And so they actually were able to go through every requirement. And to give you a sense of how important it is to go over requirements, over 60% of these were modified. So again, a lot of this might not have happened until after a contract had been signed. They would have led to change orders. They would have led to increased costs. But at this point, the state has not paid anything for these vendors, and they've already learned quite a bit. So again, advantage of this kind of procurement method. The final RFP requirements were released in December of last year, and this new RFP contained the set of requirements that had been refined. So there's been mention of the importance of taking requirements and refining them over time, because 12 months later, there surely must have been some changes, either legislative or business, programmatic, that need to be addressed. And so at this point, it is 7 months later, they're refining those RFPs. So they're as good as they can get at that point. The final proposals were due March of 11, and then the state negotiated with the single qualified vendor. Of the 2 vendors, one of those contracts was not compliant. So in the end, we ended up with 1 vendor. And, sometimes things like that happen, and we say, oh, that's too bad. But in this case, we could still say, oh, that's too bad, but we've learned a lot between the time that 10 vendors said that they were interested to having this 1 final proposal. At that point, the negotiations, I've been told, were very dynamic, and the state, along with the vendors, were able to kind of go over really important terms and conditions, things that, again, may not have been talked about until contract. And finally, we have the contract being signed in September of this year. So that is an example of how the state has shown a flexibility and some nimbleness in changing the traditional ways we've been buying these services and these systems of software to something that is quite responsive to the needs of a department, as well as the needs, hopefully the needs of vendors. And so what I've heard in my conversations with vendors who have been involved in multi-stage procurements is they've never had this kind of communication available to them before. They've never had so much information and been able to sort of explain or talk through the needs of the states and also the needs of the vendor. So those are definite and clear advantages. And the last two pages, I just wanted to point out how important it really is to refine these requirements. You see on this graphic, this triangle, on the right-hand side, the column is project stages. So this is sort of at the very top, you're starting at the beginning of at the beginning of a project, and as you move down, that's the completion of the project. And you'll see this triangle pretty much addresses the cost of fixing a poorly written requirement or an old requirement, something that's sort of out of date. The earlier in a project stage a requirement error is found, the easier and the cheaper it is to fix that. But as you go down past the requirements, designing, coding stage, the testing stage, down to final deployment, you'll see that that cost has increased 80-fold. So this is just a graphic of how expensive it can be to go through a process and not refine those requirements. And the multi-stage procurement or any kind of modified procurement where there is that sort of give and take will really help reduce on the back end, some of the costs that will come later. The earlier mistakes are found, the better. And I guess that's my key takeaway on this page is the further along a project is, the costlier it will be to fix a requirement error. So catch those errors early. And finally, I'm sorry if I'm spending too much time on these graphics, but I kind of get excited about this. as excited as one can get on procurement. The last page brings home again, I think, the need and the case for good requirements. There is something in the IT world that's often cited, the Standish Group. They have surveys that they call the chaos reports, and basically look at both the private and the public sector. Different companies that have built IT systems in a given period of time to look at success, challenge, and failure rates. And I think it's telling, how difficult it is to build these systems. These are not easy tasks in either the private or the public sector, as Fred mentioned. But you'll see over time that successful projects, which are projects that were completed on time, within budget, and with the required features, over time, progress hasn't been great. I mean, there's been some progress. But you'll see the challenge and the failure rates are pretty high. So it's hard to do these things. And I think that the state does just as well as the private sector does, though sometimes it's easy to think that we're pretty bad at this because things get blown up, things are in the media when it's public dollars. And I think that the clear takeaway from this is that it is hard to build these systems, and we really need to do everything we can to help ensure their success. And that really starts at the beginning with the planning stages, with the requirements refining, and that it all kind of goes back to the procurement and how those are run. So multi-stage modified procurements may ultimately be the best solution for addressing some of these statistics and leading to success. So, thank you.
Thank you. I have a list of questions, but Assemblymember Allen, do you have any questions that you want to ask?
Actually, I don't have any questions, but I have some comments. I've practiced law for over 30 years. In my first 3 years, I was in the courts a lot. And in the last 27 years, I was rarely in court. And what I found is that what was talked about, the common theme with all your presentations, is the incredible importance of communication and also identifying stakeholders early. Also, I think anybody who's been involved in complex problems, I've been involved in a lot of problem-solving sessions on projects where I knew nothing about the technology, but I did know something about people. I know people don't like to be surprised. People don't like to be excluded. people don't like to guess, and a lot of times people like to think they know what a project is, but sometimes it's really a voyage of discovery to figure out what exactly we're trying to achieve and do, because the more inputs you get, the more you realize the complexity and the various things you might need or not need as you go through a process. So the one thing I'd really like to encourage, this panel, and I know we're going to hear from the vendors, and I'm interested to hear what they have to say, because I think it's incredibly important that the vendor pool be transparent and open, where people feel welcome to come and participate and compete for these sort of projects. But that what you're doing in this procurement process, I would like to see all the stakeholders that are identified as an ongoing iterative process, where you just don't kind of do this and say, well, now we have some best practices with procurement, and then somehow it drifts away, because I find human beings have a propensity for setting up really elaborate structures for communication, and they think they've achieved their goal, mission accomplished, then move on, where actually this is a constant process of improvement. So I think the panel, what I'm hearing, I'm very encouraged. I think you're on the right path going forward. But over and over again, it's that aspect of inclusion, identifying stakeholders, and really making sure that, as was mentioned toward the very end of the presentation, you don't want to get toward the very end. I mean, I remember working with a major hospital in my area where I begged them to include the nurses early on in their design build process. They didn't. They had millions of dollars of change orders, and so the end users, the vendors, and I also learned in contract negotiations that. You can either be very meticulous and try to tie down every term and condition in a contract and think you can see every contingency, and rarely, if ever, is that successful. What you need are flexible documents that encourage communication and trust as you go through a project together. So those are my comments, and I think you're on the right track, and thank you.
I appreciate those comments and want to drill down a little bit more in some of the questions I have. So if we take your chart and with the pyramid that says the better job we do up front, the more dollars we save, and the greater the likelihood that we're going to have an end result, an end project that works. What are our requirements? If I'm an agency and I say I've got this problem and I believe I need a new IT system, okay? What controls do we have to make sure that before we actually go into the procurement process, I've clearly defined that problem and we know what we need? Because I think, I can think of a couple projects, I'm not going to mention them by name, but where the assumption was you could change as you go along, and it's resulted in an inordinate number of change orders and the costs skyrocketing. So do we have anything in process there where you say, Joan, I agree with you, you've got a problem, but you have to go back and do this before we're going to go to the next step?
Madam Chair, if I could, I'd like to start, and feel free, the rest of the panel members. I think really in terms of what processes or what mechanisms we have, I think probably they start within my agency, because we're the first ones to usually see a technology initiative in the form of an FSR or a concept, or folks will come and say, hey, we're thinking of moving forward on this project. So some of the things that we can do, and actually are in the process of revamping the way we review our projects, is to really do a thorough job of, in my presentation I mentioned making sure that as we review projects that we focus on the real risk issues, or on topics or items that really indicate either risk or challenges down the road. So one would be that as we review an FSR, for example, or an IT concept, or even a procurement or acquisition plan, one, to make sure that the department understands clearly what the real problem is, that they have a very clear definition of what the problem is. If they write a requirement or if they bring forward a requirement, that they've done a thorough job of vetting, okay, how does that requirement translate into a technology need that a bidder would respond to? And also making sure that they've gone through a pretty strong process of identifying, if we bring in this technology, how does that impact our business operations? What do we have to change? A lot of the change orders that come is because, what will happen often around projects is folks will say, we want the latest technology, we want it to be cutting edge, we want it to work fast, and we want it to work exactly the way the last one worked. And that's not a recipe for success. So part of what we what we can do at our agency is to make sure that departments have gone through a thorough process of identifying the impact of applying a technology solution, that they understand what it takes to implement it, what does it take, how does that implementation of that solution impact their business processes, and to Mr. Allen's point, are the stakeholders within that business process or business operation engaged so that they know they're going to have to change the way that they do business in order to really fully leverage this. Otherwise, what happens is, you start to get towards the other extreme, which is they say, well, change the way the system works so that these folks don't have to change the way they do their business processes. So, and from our part, that would include making sure there's an effective decision or governance process, making sure that they understand the impact to business operations and that they've undergone some amount of effort to identify what impact on business processes a technology solution is going to have, and that they have the willingness and the wherewithal within that agency to actually implement those changes. So on an upfront perspective, those are some of the things that we would look at as we begin to review whether it's an FSR, an RFP, an IT acquisition plan, or even their IT capital planning documents, which we require folks to do to project their needs 5 years out. DGS, I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
Well, just to elaborate, I mean, all of that's correct. The FSR, the feasibility study report, is the place where the things you were asking about are supposed to happen. That's where the business case is supposed to be made. And, the quality of those varies a lot. Some departments will come in and just basically say, here's our problem. We want to go get some technology, fix it, And this is where a lot of the back and forth and complaints about time take is the reviewing agencies tend to go back and, having had a little bit more experience, and say, well, how do you define this problem? You've talked about how your current system doesn't work, but what is it you need in order to run your business? Not just what's wrong with your system, what does it not supply, but what do you need positively in order to run your business? And so there's a lot of back and forth, and much of that has to do with the training, which we probably need to do more of in the state on how to prepare an FSR, the kinds of questions that should be answered, and so forth.
So, and what training occurs now?
I don't know if there's any formal training that...
Yeah, there is some training that's available, but I don't think it's a required curriculum that folks go through, and I apologize, but I did leave that out. One of the things that I think could be done is not only how do you write an FSR, but how do you run a procurement? What are effective and ineffective models of procurement? How do you write a requirement? How do you manage a contract once you actually have a contract or a vendor on board? How do you do business process reengineering and change management? So there's a whole set of training, let's say, skill sets that folks, I believe, need to be trained to. Now, one of the things that we have as a goal, we haven't achieved it yet within our agency, is to establish an Office of Professional Development whose focus is on skilling up the IT workforce within the state. Now, procurement officials aren't necessarily IT folks, but they play a pretty significant role in the success of an IT project. So we could certainly, spill over into that. We do have some facilities. We have training facilities currently within our agency. And I believe you guys had a certification program at one point.
Yes, we do. We have Jim, do you want to address that?
We, as part of the California Performance Review, we implemented what we call a CalPCA, the California Procurement Contracting Academy, and we offer certificates in basic procurement and in IT procurement. But the thing that we haven't done, which is a good idea that's come out of this, is we haven't said as part of the FSR and as part of your IT procurement plan, you need to have trained officials on the project.
Demonstrate the capacity.
Not just enough to have the academy, you actually have to attend, and once you have the right people on your project, then you can proceed. And that would also contribute to the success.
Yeah, it seems to me that, we can draw a line where procurement starts, but you can have the best procurement process in the world, and if you haven't done a good job defining your needs, you're not going to have the end result. And so if we agree that pyramid is correct, it seems like there needs to be much more emphasis on the front end and defining those needs. And so the department agency, whoever does the FSR, what kind of involvement does someone from that department have through the procurement process? Do they hand it off, or do they remain involved in terms of reviewing the specs and everything?
Well, it ought to be that they remain involved. I think one of the things that I would like to see us do more as a state is to have all the parties involved that are going to be involved in a project somewhere along the way get involved together at the beginning. I mean, there may be some initial stage where folks are defining their business requirements where everybody doesn't need to be involved, but CTA has a part, DGS has a part, Finance has a part, the LAO has a part, sometimes BSA has a part, the legislature sees these projects and hearings, and some of what we've experienced in the past is that they've been too linear. It's like, well, this party's involved, and they all get on board, and they take a year. Okay, now they're all copacetic, and then it goes up to the next stage, and these folks know nothing about it. They haven't been involved for the whole past year. So at a minimum, you've got all this education to go through, and then you might get hit with a question there that nobody had thought of back here, and then you get set back. So the more you bring in all the parties that you know are going to be touching this project at some point early on, I think, the greater the possibility that we'll get it right and avoid delays.
Right.
And if I could add, Madam Chair, in reality what also happens is the model is supposed to be that the department that needs the system or the technology should be the owner or at least the sponsor of the procurement all the way along. DGS does have the role of running the procurement, but they run it as a service really to this client department. The reality of what happens is it varies by agency. In some agencies, if they just don't have the capacity or the wherewithal, they pretty much just throw it over the fence and say, can you guys run this for us? And then they complain when it doesn't work the way that they want.
Why do we go forward in that situation? I mean,
well, sometimes they actually really do have a
millions
business
of dollars if you don't have capacity to implement a system successful and drive it home.
Sure. Most often because they actually really do have a pressing need to get it to achieve some sort of change.
So I don't want to keep drilling down on this. So we agree that they have a pressing need, but they don't have the capacity to bring home a system. Mm-hmm. So what should our role be in developing that capacity before we move forward?
Well, if I can, again, take the lead on it and feel free to jump in. I think there's a couple of different roles that we could play. One is, again, ensuring and skilling up the workforce within those agencies, right? Whether through an Office of Professional Development or putting them through training curriculum, or simply not approving their projects until they build that capacity. The other role that I think we have, and the state has already begun to do this, is to develop centers of excellence on running technology projects, just as in running procurement. There are some examples of that already. I think in the past we've seen, for example, Franchise Tax Board running projects, not only on behalf of Franchise Tax Board, but other agencies as well. Office of Systems Integration over at Health and Human Services does that quite a bit as well, where you have a project office or somebody that's responsible for that, where the client agency works as a customer. They're still heavily involved. They're involved in the decisions, but the actual heavy lifting of running a project is done by a center of expertise in that area.
So in these client agencies, who's running their existing programs and software?
Well, it depends on the agencies. Very often, I'll give you an example because I used to work at OSI. Some of their client agencies were rather large agencies like the Department of Social Services. So they have their own IT shop as well, but a department like that has gigantic programs that they have to run as well. So they have an IT shop that runs their own infrastructure and their own, let's say their email system and their own websites and that sort of stuff. But in terms of developing, let's say, a large, statewide eligibility system or a system like the electronic benefits transfer system, they'll contract that out to OSI. Same thing over at.
But shouldn't someone then, if they're running that now, shouldn't they be able to do the proper background work to be able to get us to a good procurement process?
Well, in those cases they do, and that's why I say it's an effective model because the program department, let's say, in this case the Department of Social Services, their focus is on understanding what are their business needs, what are their drivers, whether it's federal, state requirements, legislation, those sorts of things, working with stakeholders, which in their case are county welfare offices. So they handle that part, the part of running the procurement, the part of managing the vendor as they come in, of testing the system, doing interfaces, those sorts of things. That's what's contracted out to the Office of Systems Integration. So it's a model that actually has been pretty successful and has resulted in several very successful procurements of very large, complex technology projects. But I guess my main point being that that model doesn't have to be reserved only for the really big projects. It could also be, for more smaller or medium-sized projects where the client department really just doesn't have the capacity or maybe the resources to go out and hire a full-time project manager or procurement manager, because they'll hire somebody and 6 months later one of the bigger agencies will pick them off. So that's a model that I think works well. I don't know if you have something similar on the procurement side.
No, I just departments vary, in their skill sets, and you have some departments that are very sophisticated and don't need a lot of hand-holding, and others that, a director may just go to his IT shop and say, I got a business problem, I want a computer to fix it, and then they turn it over to the CIO, but it's really a business problem, as Carlos said at the outset of his remarks. Most of these are business problems. And while the IT part is obviously really important and we need to work on that, they're really about business reengineering and about people issues. So I think in terms of, you ask if they don't have the capacity, what we do about it. I think one of the things we do is that we require in the FSR a plan for how you're going to deal with this. If you don't have the in-house capacity, what is your plan? Are you going to contract with OSI or FTB, and so that we're talking about the solution to that problem up front and not just letting it go.
Yeah, it just seems to me that that's critical. If I can't both define my problem and define what outcome I'm looking for and how it's going to improve my business plan, and then be involved throughout the process, it just seems to me that it complicates the whole process that much more. I want to ask a question about the multi-stage or the BREEZE process, because we started out with 10 bidders submitting letters of intent, and then we had 3 bidders submit pre-qualification packages, and 1 dropped out, so we ended up with 2. And then we went into the working sessions and the final RFP, and we ended up with one qualified bidder. The one question, I've got a couple questions, but if we go through a process and we end up with 1 bidder, I think you used the term that we had dynamic negotiations, but they can only be so dynamic when you've got 1 bidder. And so when I'm taking a look at this whole pre-qualification process and all of that, should that happen even earlier in the process?
So well, go ahead, Jim.
In the Fiscal example, we actually did do that. As soon as the pre-qualification phase was completed, we had 3 vendors. We actually started negotiating terms and conditions right then. And that was the very first thing we did. And what we would prefer to do, where possible, is agree on the legal terms and conditions first, and then you really make your decision based on all the business terms and the price. Those are the things that really matter. And so we have some history doing that, but it's new. And typically the state has taken a position that we won't negotiate our terms and conditions. And so, this is just new for staff and attorneys and everyone to say, well, there's this.
It's pretty hard to bid if you don't know what the terms and conditions are, isn't it?
Yeah, well, in the past, since they said take it or leave it, then they threw it over they really.
Yeah, and I don't think we should. It should be a take it or leave it, but there's got to be some kind of guidelines. I always go back to the construction parallel for me, because being on school board for 18 years, I was involved in hundreds of $millions of construction projects, and we found when we did a constructability review before we even went to the state to get our plans approved or out to bid, and we had people tell us this will work or that'll work. If you change this, you'll save money or whatever. It really enhanced the probability that we could deliver a project on time and under budget, because we, in meeting with the different types of contractors and people, we could solve some of those problems. And so that was a pre going out. The other thing that's common in construction projects is even after you release the bids, you have a date or whatever that you set where you walk through with the bidders, and they're able to take a look at the bid documents and ask any questions they have and get them all clarified. And so that helps them when they're preparing their bid documents know that they're going to be more responsible, because they're able to ask those questions up front. So, we sort of hit a little bit on what I would call the constructability review part in terms of preparing documents, but how do we build those types of things into this process so that, we increase our probability that we will have more responsive bidders. And then the last question I have, because all of you mentioned the fact that even during that whole process, technology changes, and so how do we allow so that you've got a problem you want to solve, now something's come up, and do we allow for a bidder to say, if you want me to do X, Y, and Z, this is what it's going to cost, but the bidder can also propose A, B, and C, which might be a different way of responding to the problem that's more cost effective or a little bit more current in terms of the use of the current state of technology.
Sure. So that is a real challenge, and in fact, the way I've heard it from the vendor community is that oftentimes in our effort to try and be fair and make sure our evaluations are such that nobody can accuse us of favoritism, that we stifle innovation. We lock into a particular approach or a particular solution really early on in the process, and 3 years later, we're not willing to consider any other changes. So I think that it's a very real challenge. The other thing I wanted to just second, I guess, is your point on having the ability to have discussions with the bidders throughout the process, whether it's refining requirements or fixing weaknesses in the bids as they come in. In most cases, we build in confidential discussions with vendors along the way where they are able to ask questions and get clarifications. We're still relatively careful as to what we can and can't say. And just in fairness, sometimes we have to do that because we're afraid of the other bidders. They're going to come back and protest and then elongate the process even farther if they're not the selected vendor. But nevertheless, there is a need to do that. In terms of how do you deal with the issue of the evolution of technology, I think that as we look at these processes, especially the multi-stage approaches, there's a couple of different ways to do that. One is to allow bidders to provide optional bids or optional services or alternative approaches to what we've required without necessarily disqualifying themselves from the bid by saying, oh, your bid was non-responsive because we didn't ask for that. So one is to look at the models that we allow in terms of the bids that are submitted. What I like about that approach is that if you allow people to do that, they still have at least the specter of other competitors out there, so they're not going to come in and try to gouge you on the bid. That there's a pressure to keep their cost as low as possible, because there is still competition, and it allows for innovation. The other approach might be to allow a procurement to consider certain stages closed, whether the stages might be first pre-qualification, and if you pass that part, now you can get into, review of the requirements and how do you respond to these requirements, and maybe even allow for a technology review in the process. I don't know exactly how, that we've done this in any existing bids, but allow a technology refresh without it being deemed a change in the terms or conditions of an RFP, which again subjects you to protest or subjects you to a company coming in and saying, well, if I'd have known you were going to allow that, we would have bid. We would have been one of those. It would have been 11 pre-qualified bidders rather than 10. So there are some challenges to be addressed, but I think that there's a couple of approaches. One is, again, optional, giving folks the ability to propose alternatives, and two, maybe having a refresh or a review of the technology requirements, at a later stage in the process.
I'd just like to add that the whole concept of like an iterative review of these requirements is important. It's what everyone here is saying before and after a contract has been signed. And in the Breeze case, the working sessions were a great place for the state and vendors to refine those requirements. And again, at negotiations, which I want to underscore sort of the importance of that. And Jim mentioned the fact that we haven't done this a lot, and we're not necessarily experts at it, but I've seen it happening more and more across different projects on the state, and I think that we're getting to a point where we do have key people in the state who are very good at this, and they've come either from the private sector or have had multiple experiences on different state projects. And again, to underscore the importance of the negotiations, that's where some of the costs can be brought down. I know that was the case with the Department of Consumer Affairs and their the responses going back and forth between the vendor and sort of expectations, and not just for cost, but for actual features and functionality that would be included in the system. But again, in their case, they're also refining requirements even now post-contract, and that requires an amendment to the RFP, but it doesn't just stop at the point of signing that contract. And I think that it's important that we as a state and through this procurement process sort of evolve and understand that we have to be flexible and we have to be accurate for these requirements, and that they can take place multiple times, and that they probably should take place multiple times.
And when you were talking about the bake-off, you talked about ultimately awarding the contract, right, to the firm that, you know, where you had the highest points. How do you incorporate best value into that?
So, before getting to that, I wanted to make one more point, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying it. But on your question of, how do we get to the issue of better procurement models, I think one other very important part is I think the state as a whole, including the legislature and, the media, if we can ever get to them, has to have a certain risk or tolerance for risk and at times even failure. Because as Erica pointed out, we're finding our way through these. We're trying different models. But in some cases, we're going to find that models that we thought were great are just not going to work. Or they're going to end up with, somebody coming back and suing the state or filing a protest and lobbying your offices and saying, oh, we had it until the very end when they changed it on us. So, in the past, whenever something has gone wrong on a procurement, there's been a very reactive approach of coming in and saying, okay, well, we're going to clamp down on everything so that there's no more sense of unfairness or leaning or swaying a procurement towards a particular company. The state gets accused of that all the time. Very rarely, in fact, I don't think I've ever seen it happen, but very rarely is it actually true. It's usually perception. But I think to the extent that the state is willing to accept that as we try different procurement models, that some of them may not actually work out as great as we thought they were, you'll probably get more and more of a sense of innovation and a different approach to trying to figure these things out.
Yeah, and before Carlos answers your question, I wanted to just elaborate or emphasize that a little bit, because it was a point I wanted to make earlier that, we are excited about these new models where we open the conversation, everybody participates. I think everybody feels better about it because it's much less mysterious and everybody feels like they know more what's going on. But, as Carlos was alluding to, state government is just chock full of statutes and limitations and requirements that are oriented around making sure that our processes are fair, that they're accountable, that they're transparent, and those are good public policies. But they often get in the way of our ability to have open conversations with folks because of the dangers of the appearance or the reality that will end up not being fair, not being transparent. So as we engage in these new models, we are running a certain risks that we're, sort of moving off that very well-defined but encumbering process that we have now, and we could be venturing into this area. So far, I think most participants have been pretty happy with this more open process, but it's something we'll all need to keep our antenna out for as we move along.
Yeah, well, we all know the difference between the procurement you do when you're buying furniture is very different than the kind of procurement you do when you're buying IT, and we do. I do believe that there's a trade-off between risk and cost, and so the question is how do we define what's most cost-effective? Because you can get to that point where you escalate cost to a point where you're trying to protect against a risk where of the chance of that happening is so small and the cost of that protection is so great that it's not worthwhile. And we have to figure out what that inflection point is and make sure that we've got the balance there.
And Madam Chair, to go back to the question I think you asked earlier, which was how do you incorporate best value into the procurements or the evaluation of procurements or bids, let's say.
Well, versus the points, because we were saying we're going to take the vendor that scored the highest points.
Sure.
Right.
Well, and I think really they're one and the same. The points are assigned based on, a predetermined criteria of what is the best value to the state. And so the models that I've seen that have been successful are a couple. One is where you do the evaluation or the assessment, let's say, of the technical solution, of the capacity of the particular bidder to actually deliver, their track record, let's say, their customer references, their approach to a project, and their methodologies. You evaluate that first, and kind of in a series, if you will imagine, a series of hurdles that they have to jump. And then once you get them to pass all of those, you look at their staff, their, the track record that they have. And then when you get to the end, then you evaluate based on cost, because then you have qualified bidders, they have the capacity to deliver, they have good staff, and it's an approach and a methodology that you like. So then it becomes a matter of, and you assign points along the way, or you set them up as pass-fail gates, and then get to the issue of cost. So that's one way, because then it's still, you hopefully have enough people still competing at the end that the bid price is the lowest and best possible cost for the state. The other way is, as you assign, if you do just a traditional procurement, is that the value that you assign to cost is not so overwhelming that somebody could come in and just low bid and have the worst credentials, the worst qualifications, those sorts of things, and still win the bid. So one is modifying or making sure that cost isn't the overriding factor that just trumps everything else.
I have just one more. I've had pages of notes and pages of questions, so I'm just going to ask one more, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. But and this goes back to, I hate to give you a school board example, but it's sort of my longest reference working with in a public agency. But we had to decide: do we want to have an in-house attorney? Do we want to contract out? What are we going to do? And we ultimately decided that what we would do is we would contract with if we had a human resources issue, we'd hire an expertise in that area. If we had a construction issue, we'd hire an expertise in that area, because it was based on the decision that if we brought in a generalist in-house, we'd have someone who was just that, a generalist. And if we had a dispute, say, with a developer or someone else, we didn't want to have them hire a high-powered expert in that area and then go up against someone who was, I don't say an amateur, but not an expert in that area, because it wasn't a level playing field. So when we are, you alluded to the fact in terms of bringing in more individuals in your department in terms of procurement, or the attorneys who are reviewing the plan, do we have staff that's their area of expertise, and they're trained and they're extremely knowledgeable? So we make sure that as we write these specifications, we do have what would be considered more industry standards, and that reasonable trade-off between risk and cost. And we're writing contracts then that don't unnecessarily exclude people because of one area. I mean, do we have that?
Yeah, we do. We have attorneys in our office that are more specialized in IT. I don't know that we've got the capacity to have people doing that exclusively as nothing else in their job, but certainly the IT projects get assigned to the people who have the most experience. And then, of course, we try to do cross-training. So as IT projects come in and newer attorneys come in, we try to begin to develop their experience as well. And that's part of the kind of thing that goes back and forth between departments. I mean, there was a recent example of a department who had written their specs in such excruciating detail that they clearly there was only going to be one potential bidder. And so, we pushed back and said, that you really have to be this detailed, and can't you open it up? Otherwise, we've only got one vendor out there.
If I could comment, Madam Chair, too. In addition to the folks over at General Services, there are folks around government, and not just in the legal capacity, but even procurement or project management, or different aspects of technology that are really good and very experienced at it, and have done it on very large projects. One of the advantages I would say that we have with our agency is that we get a cross-cutting view of the different projects and systems that are being developed and are taken on across the state. The challenge is, how do you tap into this department, Jim's department, to go help a different department, right? And so one of the things that I'm very hopeful of with this Office of Professional Development is to be able to bring those folks together. Even if you don't loan a person, if you can have somebody come in and say, hey, we're going to do a session on, how do you negotiate a contract? Or we're going to go into a session on, how do you deal with these terms and conditions? Or here's how you run a good procurement. Or, here are some of the challenges that through those lessons learned, you start to cross-train folks. To be honest with you, I hadn't thought about expanding it out to the attorneys as well. But, that's certainly an area that probably would be very helpful. And as I said, there are state staff, state attorneys that have really good experience in this area.
Do you have any other questions?
No, once again, just a comment. Great questions. Specialization is great. Cross-training is very important because a lot of this is issue recognition. And the more eyes you have looking at it, the more disciplines you have looking at it up front, it saves a huge amount of grief later on. So I think that, for me, speaking personally, and talking to the chair, I would hope that maybe, in 3 months or 6 months, we could come back and revisit what you guys are doing. Because to me, I really do see this as an ongoing process of refinement and learning for all of us. So I feel that sometimes because we have so many multiple duties in the legislature and we're going from one thing to another, sometimes we don't spend enough time just kind of tracking things. And I'll leave it to our great chair to figure out how we do that. Well, you are. You're doing a great job. But we do need to kind of track this so that we're working with you so that even if it's a matter of some folks coming in from the departments and reporting to us, we kind of keep track of what's going on because it's better to be proactive than only be responsive to complaints. So that's the way I look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would not only echo those comments, but when you take a look at the state of technology in some of our agencies, it's got to change. We have, as I use this phrase, talk about it all the time, but between training our own COBOL programmers and having systems that predate collective bargaining, it costs us too much money to maintain these legacy systems. And in addition to the money, it creates extra work, it creates bad PR, and we have huge challenges ahead of us. So I think to the extent we can all work together, and I was talking with some of you earlier, I don't want a knee-jerk reaction on the part of the Assembly, and I know you're trying to work together, but to the extent we can work together and find systems that work, I think everyone's going to benefit, particularly the people of California. So thank you for coming. I look forward to continuing the discussion. And now I believe Carol. For those in the audience who don't know Carol Hinton is Vice President for State and Local Government Affairs with Tech America.
Thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here, Madam Chairman. Yes, my name is Carol Hinton, and I am Vice President for State and Local Government. Tech America does have a separate state government affairs team. Robert Callahan, who is based here in California, Christine Berman, our Senior Vice President for State Government Affairs. My role has, in the last 12 years, both with Tech America and its predecessor organization, ITAA, which was combined with the American Electronics Association, I have been focused for the last 12 years on procurement-related policies, both here in California and now in the last 4 or 5 years nationwide. And I mention that national role and that national perspective because I think that it's interesting to note in this hearing today that there are several states that are doing very innovative things and taking on procurement-related reforms that we can learn from here in California. So I'll come back to that. I want to just mention that Tech America has had a point of view. We try to view ourselves as thought leaders in the area of technology procurement policy making. Several years ago, our organization supported the legislation that created the Chief Information Officer for the state. As you recall, we had a part-time person who was also a law professor, and we were the biggest state in the union without a full-fledged state CIO. So that creation, as well as, of course, creating the California Technology Agency, shows that California is serious about this and is demonstrating a lot of leadership. I also want to mention that a few years ago, it was our association that really led an effort to undo an onerous and burdensome statute which required a 50% performance bond for all IT purchases. And so we sponsored that legislation. It was passed and signed into law. Unfortunately, it's due to sunset here at the early part of 2013. So this is something that we need to look at here perhaps in this current year. As to how to address that. And what ended up happening was that when the governor signed it, Governor Schwarzenegger signed it, he asked for a series of risk assessment guidelines be put together by Department of General Services, which have more or less been done, but more could be done to look at the totality of risk in these major procurements. And getting rid of the performance bond was a big step that was necessary. Or not, actually, I'm sorry, let me not misspeak. The statute did not eliminate performance bonds. It eliminated the mandatory 50% performance bond. So now agencies and departments have more latitude about what level of bond they wish to establish. For my testimony today, I just plan to make some general observations and then a few specific recommendations. I think you're going to hear a very common theme between what you heard already today from Secretary Ramos and Director Klass, as well as, of course, Jim Butler. Tech America does support efforts by state leaders to enact policies that enable government to utilize technology more effectively. We support whenever any state or local government can improve their management and delivery of public services through the adoption of innovative technologies and IT-enabled efficiencies. We know that, with the fiscal imperative, states need to transform the way that these programs are run. We need to break down the silos, and we need to reduce redundancies. And so, therefore, we support any policy that allows for the adoption of enterprise-wide IT approaches, shared platforms and services, and, importantly, the use of some of these emerging technologies, such as cloud computing, social media, and mobility applications. I want to just read a quote from NASCIO. NASCIO is the National Association of State CIOs, and they released a statement last February in which they said policymakers at all levels of government are seeking solutions and ideas to cut costs, reduce deficits, save taxpayer dollars, and continue to provide services with limited resources and budget constraints. They are also looking at information technology as a strategic enabler that can transform government. And when you think about it, that is just so profound and so important, because we no longer have the luxury of just doing government the way we've always done government. So to the extent that technology can be an enabler for transforming the way we meet the needs of our citizens and our important government agencies and departments, we want to support your efforts to see that happens, as well as all of the departments and agencies. I have a couple of things I would like to cite today. We've developed a few policy priorities which we believe are focused on transforming the way these programs are run, that will make some leaps forward in effectiveness and efficiency, improving productivity and cost control. So let me just give you 5 quick observations here. We need to look to states to increase collaboration and communication between the private sector and state and local government in all areas of technology acquisition, deployment, and service delivery. And we certainly heard that today from all 3 of the speakers. There's a mindset here which we embrace and we want to endorse, that there needs to be better communication and dialogue, and an open conversation, if you will. Number 2, allow for the acquisition and operation of applications, infrastructure, and solution that encompass the entire government enterprise. I mean, enterprise-wide approaches are important, and we need to do much, much more here in California, as all around the state, to look more holistically at setting up these technology solutions. Number 3, streamline the acquisition process to enable more rapid technology and solutions procurement. Just as a complete anecdote, states are finding out they don't have any way to buy an iPad, and yet iPads are being needed and used by lots of government officials, and there wasn't any vehicle to purchase an iPad because it hadn't been part of whatever contract vehicle.
List, yeah.
Pardon? It wasn't on the list.
Right.
Yeah. Number 4, appoint strong visionary IT officials with authority to align technology assets, operations, and services across the enterprise. And then number 5, preserve the private sector role in deploying technologies and providing services to government agencies and their customers. So just want to go quickly through a few recommendations. Our first recommendation, to support this policy and action that will increase collaboration and communication, we believe that to the maximum extent possible, we can and we should allow the conversation throughout the various levels of the procurement phase. It's going to serve the clients and the vendors and ultimately the taxpayers if we do so. Secondly, innovation in government programs must now be considered management and fiscal policy imperatives. We support any policy that allows state agencies and departments to operate increasingly innovative and efficient ways. And I'll just give you 2 quick examples. One is allowing for acquisition, operation of applications, infrastructure, and solutions that incorporate the government-wide enterprise. But secondly, this whole concept about streamlining the process. Sadly, it's become all too common that IT procurements can stretch out for 18 months or more. And these durations make it much more high risk and expensive for all the parties, including the government. Lengthy contracting processes can cause delays for the government customer seeking access to emerging technologies, as I mentioned, cloud computing, infrastructure and application services, mobility products and services. We believe in fair and open competition. In several states, Tech America and its member companies have pushed for and obtained contracting reforms that align the state with practices used in large acquisitions undertaken in the private sector marketplace. In the early part of the last decade, we worked very closely with California's Department of General Services to come up with a new set of Model IT terms and conditions, and that resulted in these new terms that were published on the DGS website in January 2003. So I'm very delighted to hear Director Klass say today that DGS is open to re-looking at those. And it's interesting because this will coincide with another effort that's occurring nationwide. The current state CIO of Oregon, his name is Dugan Petty, is the incoming chairman of NASCIO, and he announced at their annual conference in Denver in early October that he wants to launch a nationwide effort for all states to review their model terms and conditions for technology purchases, and he wants to work hand in hand with Tech America to do so. The state of Missouri just 2 weeks ago issued an RFI where they want to hear from vendors about what are the best terms and conditions for technology purchasing. So we at Tech America are going to use that as a launch pad to develop our own model terms, because California is not an island in this instance. And so I think California can be part and parcel of that without in learning from other states about what makes sense. A fourth recommendation is to preserve the private sector role in deploying technologies and providing services to governments. In the last 20 years, the U.S. technology industry has produced products and services that have driven the development of the global knowledge-based economy, dramatically increased the profitability of companies and productivity of individuals, and have enabled governments around the world to perform new missions in new ways. And we believe the IT industry must be empowered to bring its most innovative thinking and transformative IT solutions to the challenges facing government programs. Conversely, we oppose arbitrary mandates and restraints that, while well-intentioned, often limit the options available to the government IT customer. So before I close, I'd like to offer one very specific recommendation pertaining to California, and that's the clarity here that we need to have between DGS and the California Technology Agency. All three individuals spoke about it here this morning, and I think it's just imperative because right now vendors just don't know which one of these two government entities is in charge. There are blurry lines between policy setting and operational implementation of procurement policies. And this ambiguity has resulted in unnecessary confusion. So we believe this either needs to be addressed by the legislature or by the executive branch. So I'd like to just finish by acknowledging the incredible help that key individuals have been. In particular, Jim Butler has been a very dedicated public servant, and he has brought a level of professionalism to that role and that job. And he has definitely permitted an openness and dialogue, which we have really found useful and we appreciate so much. I mean, the transparency has increased with working between the vendor community and DGS. And likewise, I'm very hopeful and encouraged by the appointment of people like Secretary Ramos and Director Klass, because we do believe that this can all continue as we go forward in the years to come. So with that, I will close, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Do you have questions or comments?
Just one question. I think I was tracking pretty well what you were saying, but sometimes when you mentioned arbitrary restraints, so could you make that concrete? Could you give any example of those kind of things that you're concerned about? There are often times where it just seems like the process, the rules. I think what was talked about today, these RFPs are filled with voluminous terms that are extraneous. They're not helpful to the final process. There are extra things that are sometimes built into statute that we find just difficult to conform with. Lots of rules around percentages of small business participation and whatnot. It's not necessarily so arbitrary, but it just makes it a complex undertaking when you're getting into procurement. Yeah.
And you said you're working with other states, checked with the vision in Oregon of trying to create a national best practices, I guess.
Yes.
What's the timeline for?
Well, Oregon actually went ahead and did something, and they have created, or not created, they have established terms and conditions. I'm hoping that the time frame for this new national effort will only be this 1 year. I think that there's so much energy and enthusiasm for doing so. And it doesn't mean to say that every state will embrace it. New Jersey has a 5x, 5 times liability restriction that they don't think is a problem. California currently has 2x. It's 2 times the aggregate purchase price of a contract for the limit on its liability. But there are many states, or not many, there are a handful of states that have no limit on liability, Arizona being a case in particular. So I think about a year's time is what we're hoping.
And I know Jim's still in the back. Is California participating in that dialogue?
Well, it just is getting underway, and I was talking to Jim about it this morning, so I think that we can be hopeful that California definitely will want to do so.
Right. Jim gave me the thumbs up.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I agree with all the goals you have, and I do believe there's a very strong role for the private sector here because when you read all the books, good to great. I mean, I could list dozens of books on effective businesses and leadership, but the bottom line, they all say, you know, a business should stick to its core values and core product and what it does best. And you know, if you take a look at what the core mission is, the state of California, it's delivering high quality education. It's delivering health and human services product. It's it's running your public safety correction. And there's certain core missions that we have, and that's what we should be focusing on. And we should then, those other in other areas where we can buy expertise, because that's not part of our core mission or our core area of expertise, and we should rely on that. And as you know, I'm a big supporter of cloud computing, and I think we're all going to be there. It's just a matter of time and how quickly we move to it. One comment I had written down with the prior panel that I didn't bring up, but when we talk about whether or not you've got 3-digit codes or 5-digit codes or whatever, I mean, to the extent that we have better vertical integration and consistency within agencies and departments on down, I think it's going to make changing in the future that much easier, because I don't think things are going to slow down. I think they're going to speed up. I also, we are working now on planning a session in January on the use of apps in government, because I do think there are a number of different opportunities, and whether I don't think we're going to be able to just make a full migration, but the question is, I think when we do get involved in major procurements, that's another question we should be asking ourselves in terms of who it is, the people we serve, and how we're able to provide information in a more efficient manner. So, thank you, and I'm happy to work with you, by the way, on the sunsetting and extending that, so we can.
We welcome that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we have time for any kind of input, testimony from the public. You can sit at the table if you want. That makes it easier.
Hi, my name's Stephanie. I'm with SEIU Local 1000, and we actually represent all of the IT professionals in the bargaining units to the in state government. So we just wanted to comment that our members are very interested in how the process works. They're all the ones who are actually participating in the process. We just wanted to comment on a couple of things. One, to let you know that some departments actually do contract out to have people develop their RFPs and things like that. So it isn't just state employees who are doing those processes. So you should be aware of that. Additionally, it's not just, we have qualified people who are doing work on the state employee level, but that there are also appointments in the director positions and deputy directors and things like that who may not have any qualifications on IT who are directing these projects. So there should be some acknowledgement that there are qualified people who do the work in state service, the civil service, but that there are people who are highly involved in these projects who could have no background at all in IT directing the projects. So just as a point of reference, so you can understand sort of some of the confusion maybe sometimes on why things don't always are clear. So we look forward to continuing to work with you on your in the select committee, because we're very interested.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment. I'm glad you came to testify today, because a lot of times we talk about these developments and what we're doing. I always think about the end users and the people who are actually going to be using these systems. And I personally feel that a lot of times we put a lot of energy into the procurement, trying to define what we're going to do, purchase, and then when it gets to the end users, a lot of time, and hopefully their input has been taken into consideration, but the actual training to get the full value of these programs, because I've seen so many times they'll have a tremendous capacity, but the staff only scratch the surface because the training, ongoing training, and having, a train-the-trainer program sometimes gets neglected. And I feel like a lot of times we don't get the full value of our programs because the end users, well, hopefully they're going to be involved in the design of the systems, but also the ongoing training they need to really get the maximum value for the public and for their own satisfaction as workers.
And many of the contracts that are developed have ongoing, because it should be the state employees who are maintaining these systems on an ongoing basis. It shouldn't be a contractor who's continued to do that, because we shouldn't be paying for that. That's why we have state employees. And so we want to make sure that those contracts are fulfilled and that knowledge is passed on to the state employees. And so that's sort of the purpose of why we have IT professionals in state government. So our members are very interested in continuing to work with you.
Great. I would just echo some of Alan's comments in terms of the need to involve people at all levels up front in defining what the needs are, and then also in making sure that when we take a look at the cost of a project, that we're including in that cost the any new equipment that that the employees need, any training that they need, so we don't just hand you something and say, here, make it work, but we make sure that the ingredients for success for a project go from the very beginning to the time it's implemented. So,
Yeah, and that there are many highly skilled state employees, and we just want to make sure that everybody's looking at what we actually have in state government as opposed to looking outside before they do that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dave Busser. I head up corporate development for ESRI. ESRI is actually the world's leader in geographic information systems technology. And for the past 20 years, we have been the principal provider of GIS to the state of California. Prior to joining ESRI 9 years ago, I spent 20 years in IT. I was a chief information officer, and I've run projects in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and I do feel your pain. I would argue that technology is advancing so quickly that some of them, frankly, I think that what Secretary Ramos spoke of and Director Klaas spoke of are absolutely methods that have been proven successful in the past, but in very large projects, especially given the evolution of technology, and also my personal belief and my experience that users rarely understand what their requirements are until you help them to understand their requirements through prototypes and proofs of concept and so forth. Can be very challenging. But I'm here to talk about a simpler problem, which is the acquisition of commercial off-the-shelf software and services, which is what ESRI provides. Now, we at ESRI believe we've done everything we can to work with the state agencies to try to adhere to the procurement requirements and to work within the procurement process. But we think despite these efforts, it's honestly been very, very difficult for us. We have found the process onerous, inconsistent, and we honestly feel that it frequently does not serve the needs of the state agencies and the employees of the state that rely on our technology. Now, the principal procurement vehicle that we've been asked to use is the California Multiple Award Schedule, or CMAS, and that contract vehicle is based on the General Services Administration schedule that ESRI has with the federal government, who is our largest customer. Now, the GSA schedule was put in place by the federal government to ensure that federal departments were able to get access to high-quality goods and services at a low price and in a cost-effective manner and in a timely manner. It's our understanding that the state chose to base CMAS on GSA so that they would have access to the same pricing that our best customer does. However, what we've also found is the state does not necessarily want to be bound to the same licensing terms and conditions that the federal government has agreed to. Technology evolves. Useful technology, if it's to remain useful, has to continue to evolve. And we have to modify our licensing terms as our products change. And when we adapt these terms, we have to submit them to the federal government. They review them. They approve them. Sometimes they want to negotiate some of these terms. But the state will not accept the terms that have been agreed to by the federal contracting officer. And even though we indicate that the standard state terms do take precedence over the federal terms, and that both federal and state take precedence over the commercial terms, they still will not accept them until they've done their own review. And they tell us that they don't have time to do the review. So as a result, state employees today cannot buy ESRI technology on this schedule. As a result, we have worked to come up with other methods of procurement, working with the state agencies. And what we've done is now when we get a request, we issue a quote. It indicates ESRI's standard licensing terms, but also indicates that, once again, the state licensing terms take precedence over our licensing terms. Well, sometimes, in some cases, this will work fine. We'll submit this, and it'll be approved, and we'll fulfill the order. Other times, we will submit precisely the same terms, precisely the same language, and objections will be raised, and there are months of delay being able to fulfill the orders. And it's very difficult for us to understand why it works sometimes and why it doesn't, which is why I say that we really do run into problems with consistency. So these many challenges, they result in, most importantly, the fact that state employees don't have access to our technology when they need it, but it also delays state GIS projects. It certainly results in lost time and cost. And also it can result in the interruption in technical services that are required by the state. We are very interested in working with the state. All 50 states are our customers. Thousands of local governments are our customers. We have not just the United States, but around the world. So we have quite a lot of experience. And for what it's worth, California is not the only government organization that we work with that we sometimes have challenges with. But I will say that these are probably among the most difficult for us. So what we would suggest is that that you give consideration to a few things. One is to, again, and I know that this was discussed today and you're working on it, but the idea of trying to establish a consistent, functional, fair practice that works every time and that can be easily implemented by ESRI and by the state. This is a nuisance for ESRI, but we aren't, just so we're clear, we're not the victim here. We really believe that the victims are the state employees and honestly the California taxpayers that are depending on the employees' services. I would ask you to consider relying on the U.S. government's review and approval of the terms that you are basing your CMAS contract on, especially given the fact that your standard licensing terms take precedence over the federal terms. We would ask that you consistently apply CMAS guidelines. One of the issues we run into is that we're not allowed to offer maintenance, software maintenance, or software-related services under CMAS, but the CMAS guidelines clearly say that that's an acceptable practice. And so we've never been able to really understand why we can't do that. And last thing I would say, I guess, is that commercial off-the-shelf software has many benefits. Theoretically, it's been designed with best practices in mind. We certainly believe that ours has. And it's frequently a very effective alternative to building something in-house. But when you buy commercial off-the-shelf software, it comes with a certain number of business terms, licensing terms that are associated with it in the case of software. And we really believe that when you make a purchasing decision, part of the criteria you're using are the terms associated with that commercial product. So, and again, to the extent that ESRI can help in this process, it would be, of course, our great pleasure. And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Well, it's not too bad. We went only about 20 minutes over, but I want to, first of all, thank everyone who testified today for taking time out of your busy schedules, both from those in-state, from our different agencies, as well as Carol coming up and sharing all of your thoughts with us. And I also, as Assemblymember Allen suggested, I hope this is the beginning of a longer conversation, because I think all of us, especially those of us who live in California and have been here for many years and love the state, want to do all we can to embrace technology to make the state more efficient, and in doing so, hopefully free up dollars so we can spend those dollars on programs that we value. So I look forward to the conversation continuing.
Yes, and for those who gave some testimony, I guess I'm making the assumption that there's going to be dialogue to work out the problems, and if they're not, I know that our offices would be interested in helping in any way possible. But as we discussed extensively today, communication is the key, and so I would just encourage those folks, especially the last speaker who talked about the concerns, that there be some dialogue with DGS and the other, our technology agency, to try to work those issues out. So thank you.
Thank you.